Welcome to TrineDay's The Ignored, a conversation with researchers who came from different directions and ended up talking about the same set of characters and deeds. Part of the story is how they got here and what their discoveries mean, not only to them, but also for our children and for the future of the world. I am Bruce the Taurus, moderating. Our host is Kris Millegan, musician, writer, researcher, publisher at TrineDay, and host of the Journey podcast. Kris's father, Lloyd Millegan, entered U.S. intelligence as an 18-year-old exchange student to China in 1936. Soon he was working in C.O.I, Coordinator of Information, under William Wild Bill Donovan, which morphed into the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. While there, Lloyd was drafted. OSS placed him in G2, Army Intelligence, and got him assigned to MacArthur's staff, where they had some concerns. This led to intrigue that ended up with Lloyd leaving the agency, now the CIA, soft in 1957 and leaving altogether in 1959. In 1969, along with Professor D.F. Fleming of Vanderbilt, Lloyd talked about his 20-year intelligence career to Kris, and it took Kris many years to process what he had heard, and it launched him on 50-plus years of reading, research, and hanging out in conspiracy theory land. Also with us are Ed Berger, Nick Bryant, Jim Norman, and Daniel Hopsicker. Ed Berger is an independent writer and researcher in Kentucky who has written several books, including Uncertain Futures, an assessment of the conditions of the present, and the forthcoming Thesis on the Meta-Cartel. Ed was Whitney Webb's main researcher for Volume 1 of One Nation Under Blackmail, the sordid union between intelligence and organized crime that gave rise to Jeffrey Epstein. And Ed can be followed on Twitter at EBBerger. That's EBBERGER. Nick Bryant has had mainstream and investigative work appear in USA Today magazine, Playboy, Salon, Vanity Fair, and other publications too ignominious to mention. Nick authored The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal, and co-authored Confessions of a D.C. Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail. And he contributed a chapter on child trafficking to Global Perspectives on Dissociative Disorders, Individual and Societal Oppression. And he investigated the Jeffrey Epstein network and published Epstein's Little Black Book on the internet in 2015. In June this year, his new book will be published, The Truth About Watergate, a tale of extraordinary lies and liars. Jim Norman spent 11 years as a writer for Businessweek in Detroit, Minneapolis, Houston, and Connecticut. He joined Forbes in 1990 and resigned after 5 years over censorship of his groundbreaking investigation into government, bank cyber spying, and Clinton-era corruption. He then returned to his longtime focus on oil and energy companies by joining McGraw-Hill's daily oil journal, Platts Oilgram News. His 2001 story on Enron's accounting tricks helped trigger the SEC investigation that led to Enron's demise. In 2008, his history of global oil price manipulation, The Oil Card, was published by TrineDay, and it remains an important primer on modern economic warfare. Daniel Hopsicker is the author of Barry and the Boys, Welcome to Terrorland, and the soon-to-be-released Gangster Planet. You can follow him at his site, which is madcowprod.com, which stands for Mad Cow Productions. And now, our host, Kris Millegan.
This really gets to kind of a dream of mine of getting a bunch of the authors that I've had the privilege of publishing together and letting them talk and discuss, because, you know, there was a reason why I started TrineDay, because, well, I was writing a book and nobody was going to publish it. And the most wildest and courageous publisher out there that I knew of even told me, he says he didn't think he was ready to take on Skull and Bones. So I says, well, I've got to start thinking about doing it myself. And then Daniel Hopsicker came along, and I helped him work with Barry and the Boys. And, you know, it was floating all around New York for many years. And he says, nobody's going to publish it. So I says, well, I've got a computer on my desk. They tell me I can publish a book. Let's come and do it. So that's what started me doing publishing. And, you know, Bruce called me and says, well, what are we going to call this? And I says, well, we're going to call this The Ignored, because these books that I have published by Jim Norman, Nick Bryant, Daniel Hopsicker, Whitney Webb are books that have a big effect on people when they read them, okay, but they are completely ignored by the mainstream press. I mean, they don't even hold us up and call us names, because I figure, you know, if we got any attention, that wouldn't be good. So we're basically ignored. You know, I'm the son of a Intel guy who told me some things that I didn't understand and started to go towards and looking at them. We have, you know, Nick Bryant, who was given a story from Rolling Stone, and it developed into the Franklin scandal. And he knew everybody in New York. He told me, New York's going to publish my book. And I says, well, remember me? And he came back and says, yeah. And so we published that. Jim Norman done some amazing things in the mainstream media, got basically asked to leave. And, you know, his book gets ignored. Daniel's broke so many stories, it's not funny. And I mean, it's like he tells a story about one time he was sitting talking to somebody, and he was talking about Barry Seal, and then he asked another question, and the guy said, hey, you know, I was going to talk to you about Barry, but now you're compromising, you know, ongoing operations. And the guy got up and left. Again, like we get ignored. And then we have, you know, Whitney Webb's book, which, you know, really is a deep dive. And, you know, one thing I was really happy to see, because, you know, we've got a couple of people here that were born in the 40s. We've got some people here that were born in the 50s. Bruce was born in the 60s, and Ed here was born in the 80s, you know. And so it's good to see, you know, how this information rolls and what it's doing. And like I say, I wanted to bring these people together because I've done it before at conferences where people have, well, they've all read each other's books and whatnot, but when you get them together and you have some discussion, things happen. So let's have some discussion, fellas. And I really appreciate everybody spending the time and coming to this table and talking. So thank you very much, everybody. And one thing I really want to talk about here too is J. Orland Grabby, because it was an amazing time on the internet when Jim, along with J. Orland, started releasing information. And they did this thing. It was about banking allegations and stuff. And every day there'd be this new internet drop. And it got so exciting. And I mean, they'd put Casper Weinberger's secret Swiss bank account number in there and all kinds of other things. And we all expected, well, something's going to happen. And Jay Orland got on CBS with Leslie Stahl, and that was about it. And Whitney was supposed to be on here. She had some trouble with sitter arrangements, and I got an email from Ed, who was her main researcher for Volume 1. He says, you know, I'd like to talk to James Norman, because he's in Kentucky and he's been doing some work on Chuck Hayes, who was a person I want to bring up in this discussion, because he's somebody that a lot of people haven't heard about. I mean, Whitney was sending me her different chapters, and I was reading them and looking at them, and I says, wait a minute. Whitney doesn't know about J. Orland Grabby, because he'd been scrubbed out of the internet, you know, and this was this thing that was this big thing, and then it's gone completely scrubbed. So something's going on. So again, I really appreciate this discussion. And I want to start with Jim, if you don't mind. Tell us about J. Orland and how you met him, and a bit of the background of that whole story.
I was a mainstream reporter. I was working at Forbes magazine. After doing some other investigative stories, I ended up bumping into the infamous Promise software story, which I think it's one of these mystery conspiracy things that has lingered around the internet for a long time. Has never really been properly, completely explained. But anyway, that got me going into the netherworld of intelligence activities, and it was a database kind of software. I had learned was that it was being used in the banking system some way by the intelligence community to track overseas money transfers, particularly through money center banks. And so I was doing some research on a company called Systematics in Arkansas, which was one of the marketers, handlers, users of this software. And what I came across mysteriously on the internet this was in the mid-90s, somebody had actually compiled a list of all of the internet references, press releases, and everything from Systematics and put them together in one spot on the internet where you could find it. And I stumbled onto it. The person who did that was J. Orland Graby, who was a former Wharton Business School professor and computer genius. At one point, I think he worked somehow with the NSA. He had also gotten curious about Systematics and was enraged that this company was basically monkeying with banking privacy and doing nefarious things. So that's how we connected. I got a hold of him and said, well, what's up? What's your interest with Systematics? And from there, we went deeper and deeper into the Systematics thing and what the intelligence community was doing with it. It turns out it was all part of the Reagan era follow the money effort to bust the Soviets, but then it morphed into something much bigger than that. Well, Orland had the computer brains to track a lot of this stuff down. I was kind of like the Jimmy Olsen leg man trying to get some further information on this from the mainstream side. And in the midst of all that, another character emerged, and his name was Charles Hayes, who is a mystery character to be sure. He knew lots of stuff about Promise. Apparently he had deep connections in the intelligence community, and he and Orland got hooked up and they had their own kind of thing going. And Hayes, I think, and other sources Orland had fed Orland a whole bunch of amazing background stuff about corruption in the government, the Vince Foster story, money laundering, all this kind of. So Orland actually launched what became the model for the Drudge Report. He put up his own webpage, and every day he would populate it with summaries of news stories and his own kind of daily essays revealing more and more of the layers of the onion. The thing got to be extremely popular, and then he started putting up some pictures of scantily clad women, and that immediately drew more attention too. But that became the model for the Drudge Report. Matt Drudge picked it up, the same format, model, and everything, and then he kind of ran with it. And again, I think Drudge probably had some wind put in his sails by the deep state or whatever, somebody's deep state. And it kind of took on a life of its own, but pretty soon we ran into a brick wall. The powers that be really tried to put the kibosh on this whole thing. Hayes ended up being prosecuted, convicted, sent to prison on a bogus murder for hire charge of all things, which we came to think was just a way of laundering his way out of the public eye and creating a appearance of a criminal record for him so he could go off do other things. Some people say they saw him out and about walking around doing other things for the government after he was convicted. Who knows? It was just one mystery after another. And Orland, he ended up going into the kind of a cryptocurrency business, tried to start his own bank. I think that he got taken down by bad guys who put him out of business. He ended up living in Costa Rica. Then he had some health problems, died down there living in the former Russian embassy in Costa Rica. So it's been a strange tale from the get-go.
Right. Well, he was, one of the first people, his first textbook was about derivatives, and he was one of the first people to talk about that. So he had quite the understanding. Now, I want to know about these manila folders that were sent to congressmen and senators that resigned. Yep. Did that really happen?
Yeah, in some form or other, I'm convinced that did happen. Hayes, when we first ran into Hayes, the story that he kept around himself was that he was the kind of frontman spokesman for a mysterious group called the Fifth Column, which supposedly was a handful of renegade intelligence community cyber experts who had obtained the use of a supercomputer that they were having to foreign banking accounts and transactions, gathering information on all kinds of stuff. The story had a lot of holes in it. There was never any hard proof. So I kind of figured it was a cover story for something else that was going on, probably some official internal governmental policing of corruption within the government. And this was a way of kind of leaking it out to let it be known. And I think Orland and I and others just kind of became a convenient way to dribble this out. Just the way the Fifth Column worked was their strategy, as Hayes would explain, it was to just gather up massive amounts of incriminating information on people in government, particularly Congress, senators, other government officials, put it together in a thick manila envelope, deliver it to the people, let them read it, and then they get an option. They can either resign or be prosecuted. And what resulted, there's no question about this, and this was in the early 90s, began like 93 or so, there was a massive wave of mysterious exits, resignations, engineered election losses, which cleaned out an amazing roster of high-level, big-name government officials who just left the scene to spend more time with the family. That was that became kind of the self-fulfilling indicator that there was something going on here, because these are bogus excuses why these powerful people were leaving.
Jim, have you written up the entire story you just told?
No, it's in bits and pieces out there. I was always kind of waiting for the final shoe to drop, the final chapter, something to come out of this. But it was like there wasn't that final nail in the coffin to nail it down. And there was so much official denial. And Hayes, he was very cagey. He would never actually provide any of these documents. There was lots of circumstantial evidence all over the place that made it look good, but coming at it from a traditional mainstream journalism point of view, there was never quite enough there to go on the record with this stuff. And so the story now, it kind of lingers in memory.
Some of the stuff that Hayes had, like the Casper Weinberger Swiss bank account number, came out of Barry Seal's trunk. So Ed, you've been looking at some of Charles Hayes's stuff. What have you uncovered? And what do you think about it? Being are you a millennial or Gen Z? What are you?
I fall in the millennial category. I find it extremely fascinating in light of a lot of the other kinds of things that have been taking place in Kentucky. Like one of my big ends into, I guess, deep politics, for lack of a better word, was reading Sally Denton's Bluegrass Conspiracy when I was a kid. And both my parents came from Lexington, so this was always like a book that you would hear about. Like you go to events in Lexington and you would just always hear rumors like this story that happened, this drug smuggling cops who were protected by the CIA and whose corruption extended all the way up to the governor's office. And so it was strange, because when I was working with Whitney on One Nation Under Blackmail, I became very interested in these bankers from Tennessee, Jake and C.H. Butcher, the Butcher brothers. And they kind of presided over this massive banking empire in the 70s and into the 80s. And they were very close to figures like Burt Lance, who was budget and management head in the Carter administration, who worked very, very closely with Jackson Stevens of the systematics company that Jim was just talking about. And so these Butcher brothers were part of this whole kind of banking milieu that overlapped with this promise scandal. And when they came up kind of in the periphery of the Epstein network, and as I looked more at them, I discovered that they also overlapped with what Sally Denton had been talking about. And so I'm not sure if any of this research ended up in the book. I think they're alluded to in some of the footnotes. But I got, a real bee in my bonnet about these guys and ran down basically anything that I could find about it. And I discovered that they, in addition to Tennessee, had a bunch of kind of shady banks scattered all across Kentucky, ostensibly to dump money into the coal industry, which is its own kind of rabbit hole. But their main foothold in Kentucky was in Somerset, this little town about an hour from where I am right now. And I reached out to some people who were doing kind of like research on Kentucky corruption and other just general weirdness in the bluegrass. And around that time, Kris, you sent the material to Whitney, the Gravy Hayes material, realized, this Chuck Hayes character was operating in the same exact place as where the Butcher brothers and their strange banks were operating. They weren't able to get back to me while we were doing the book, but shortly after the book was published, they messaged me and like, oh, it just so turns out that we are also looking into the Butcher brothers. And at the same time, they were looking into Chuck Hayes. And the way the research is kind of falling, we haven't necessarily threaded these two things together, but it is looking increasingly likely that there are overlaps in these networks. And they do have a tendency to appear kind of in the same locations at the same time, using the same banks. And so it's an ongoing investigation. I'm very excited to see where it will take us. Definitely started to get people coming out of the woodwork talking about having known Hayes, having knowledge of his like pretty large scale arms dealing, his involvement in a massive jewel theft ring. I'm not sure if it was necessarily theft. It might have been kind of like a customs fraud, but he was importing massive amounts of jewels from Brazil to various companies in Lexington. And there's rumors, none of which can be like totally verified, but that's kind of a reoccurring motif in this story, that these jewel kind of imports might have had to do with payments for the sale of the Promise software abroad, which is what Chuck Hayes was allegedly up to in this period. It's kind of a convoluted answer, but it's a convoluted story.
Well, my daddy told me, he says, the Vietnam War is about drugs and whatnot. So I, started to research a lot about the subject I called CIA drugs. And the interesting thing is a lot of those players are, involved in a lot of this other corruption. And then while I was looking at CIA drugs, there's basically the importation of narcotics and that. And then I saw a thing I called CIA the dark side, which had to do with the use of drugs and psychological warfare and different things. And this led me to finding out about honey traps and different things. And then Nick Bryant, brought me his book, Franklin Scandal. And, one of the biggest pits in my stomach that I took away from that book was, here we had the FBI running around, doing interference for these guys doing honey traps, blackmail. And we're talking a lot about the methods of blackmail that have been used, to is it to just make money, or is it to, affect our future, to affect our government? And I mean, Nick, can you tell a little bit of how, you got to the story and the resistance that you had on just telling the story that you uncovered?
Sure. I was in the office of a Rolling Stone editor, and he wanted me to pitch him stuff. And I said, well, what do you want me to pitch you? And he said, give me the darkest stuff you can think of. And I kind of threw up my arms in the air and I said, Nazis, Satanists. I mean, what do you think? And that glint in his eye, he said, Satanists. So I had a simple plan. I was going to hang out with some Satanists, go to a black mass, write an article. It was a very simple plan, and get a fairly good payday. But as is the case with writing and curiosity, I found myself, whenever I'm tasked with whatever subject it is, I'm surf the internet, look for tangential stories. And then I came across a cult called the Finders. The Finders had been busted. Two of the Finders had been busted in Florida with 6 children, and they were charged with multiple counts of child abuse. And the children were put in protective services, and actually one of the kids showed signs of sexual abuse. And then those 2 finders who were dressed nicely in suits, were indicted on or charged with multiple counts of child abuse. There was a U.S. Customs report on this, and a search warrant was executed on the Finders warehouse. And U.S. Customs and the Washington, D.C. police found really nefarious things. I mean, including what seemingly is child pornography. And all of a sudden, the case was quashed. And the last lines of that U.S. Customs report, the C.I.A. has said that this is an internal investigation, no further action will be taken. And I kind of thought at that point, this was in 2002, I kind of thought at that point I knew how the world worked. I knew that the CIA was out there fomenting coups to help our multinational corporations and making sure that things didn't get nationalized, the communists didn't take over. I knew that the CIA was up to all that stuff, but what was the CIA doing with this very strange cult? I mean, that did not fit into my paradigmatic view of how I saw the world. I mean, it just didn't fit in. And so I started to look for instances of that, and that led me to Omaha, Nebraska, where there was a similar incident where the FBI had covered up child trafficking, which and actually local police had covered up child trafficking, and the Department of Justice had covered up child trafficking. And child trafficking and molestation is probably the most heinous crime. I think it's the most heinous crime someone can possibly commit. And I'd written a lot of about children's issues prior to that. And I could not get my mind around that our government was covering up child trafficking, aiding and abetting child trafficking. And I was really stunned by it. And I was very skeptical of it until I went to Nebraska. But once I went to Nebraska and I came across a bunch of documents and I interviewed people. And when I was interviewing people, it was like I was doing an expose on the KGB and Stalinist Russia. I mean, people were terrified to talk to me. And then I ultimately got a death threat. And by the time I left Nebraska, I realized this is all true. I mean, our government, or some malignant corner of it, of our intelligence, is aiding and abetting child trafficking. And that just stunned me, because what it showed, and there was blackmail involved in this network too. And what it showed me is that there's no line in the sand anymore. There's no moral demarcations as far as our intelligence goes, or that dark, malignant corner of our intelligence. They will do anything it takes to get power, because I think this is about power. It's about controlling politicians and getting power.
Right. So, Jim, when you went to Forbes with the story, okay, and it went through all the fact checkers, Okay, you expected this thing to come out in Forbes, right? This story that you wrote, Fostergate.
Yeah, I was still lumbering under the illusion of truth and justice would triumph, and wasn't really counting on that thumb on the scale at the end of the day. But my view has changed. Let me just offer one thought here that might connect a bunch of dots here between what we're talking about. One of the characters I came across in the oil business was a longtime CIA guy, and he said, the simple formula that we're talking about here, it's MICE, M-I-C-E, money, ideology, compromise, ego. These are the ways you control people. But it's not just blackmail. Blackmail would be a function of it. But as Nick was saying, the object of the powers that be here is to control everybody that they need to, and get everybody else to march along in lockstep. And these are the essential tools that you use: money, ideology, compromise, and ego. I've ended up spending a lot of time focusing on the money side, particularly money laundering, which is really, I think, what makes the world go round. There's a lot more of it going on than anybody realizes. There are a myriad of vehicles for accomplishing it. The essential element of money laundering, carrying around cash and bag, it's a mispriced transaction of some kind. That's why you run into a lot of this stuff in the oil business, because there's so many zeros on the numbers. The valuations of the assets are so amorphous. That's why the art business is so perfect for money laundering, and even real estate. Things like real estate is more difficult because those prices are more trackable. But it's a money go round, and the compromise thing is equally essential in all this. And there's no better way to compromise somebody than with the kind of stuff that Nick's talking about. So we're dealing with the many tentacles of a control mechanism here, which operates under its own laws and its own rationales and its own justifications. And there is no rule of law that is going to counteract it, because it is the law. And that's what we end up against here. So, I mean, the thing that keeps me going and sane in all this is that, okay, even if we're not going to become rich and famous trying to write about this stuff, at least if we can get it into print or into the media, some kind of media somehow, so it's there's a record established, then they can't just say it never happened. So if we can just accomplish that, we're doing a lot. Yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, we're taking notes. Sometimes that's all you can do. Daniel, are you able to speak yet? He has a lot to add about the money laundering and all this different stuff, the stuff that he's been looking at. And again, and it gets to drugs too, because, one of my posits has been, well, they keep the drugs illegal because they can sell them for 8 times what they're worth, which gives them this big pile of cash, which allows them to, like you said, mice money, spread it around and do the corruption. And, there's been, even mainstream people who said, well, if the drug trade wasn't out there, the banks would have gone down a long time ago. And a central part has been this promise software. So is there anything we can do besides take notes?
I think the important thing is to get this information out, like Jim was saying, and make sure that it's solid, that it can't be assailed. And because the biggest tool against the truth is lies. But if someone's going to do a hatchet job on your work, actually, you've made a lot of progress, because usually, as you had said, Kris, it's just ignored. And when I came across the Franklin scandal, and I proved it with sealed grand jury documentation. Kris knows the amount of documentation I had to prove that book. I was simply ignored. And I had a number of connections to various media when the book came out, and I was simply ignored. And I think that that really shows, because I remember pitching this story to people, and actually subsequently Epstein. And I'd be there in an editor's office, and I would tell them about the story, and then I could see their machinations in their eyes. They would say to themselves, I could see the cognitive dissonance go down. They would say to themselves, well, this is really a horrible story, and all these children are getting abused, and I really need to help Nick Bryant break this open so people know about it. Or I can just write Nick Bryant off as crazy, and then I can go home tonight and, you know, have a nice dinner with my family. So that is the cognitive dissonance that I saw going down when I would pitch first Franklin and then Epstein. These editors wanted nothing to do with it, and they would much rather write me off as crazy than deal with the truth about this, because people are very concerned about their money, power, and prestige. I mean, not only in politics, but everywhere. And I think a lot of editors knew that if they took this on, it could definitely minimize their money, power, and prestige. And I had a friend who worked at a major magazine in New York City, and he was an editor. And I pitched that magazine after Franklin. That magazine really wanted nothing to do with me, but my friend would occasionally pitch stories, my stories. And the last one, he was, I guess his boss took him out to lunch and said, no more Nick Bryant stories. Well, but anyway, so this editor that took him out to lunch, she does not think that there was blackmail involved with Epstein. I mean, she's an editor of a major magazine, and she is that obtuse. I mean, and she doesn't need to be compromised. She doesn't need to make Faustian pacts. She is just ignorant and myopic. And a lot of people in the media are proactive and collude, but then there's a lot of people in the media that are on the reservation, and they don't even know that there's a reservation.
Well, I want to say some kudos to Nick Bryant, because he was the person that made Epstein's black book public. Okay. And now, Ed, I want to ask you a question here, because Nick and Jim and I, you know, and we lived through some of this history. Okay. We saw it unfold and researched into it. Okay. Now, you're looking at it from, you know, the rear view mirror per se, and having to, you know, read books and look into obscure places to find out these things. So how is that? What, you know, do you think you're uncovering the true history? What do you think you're doing while you're researching?
My background before I kind of started working in this area, I did a lot of writings on economic history, but also like kind of arts and culture issues, particularly subculture histories. I've always kind of approached these different topics from kind of a historical perspective, because I've always felt that, you know, maybe it's a cliche thing to say, but you have to understand the history of how we got here in order to understand where we are, where we're going to go from here, you know. Before I, you know, worked with Whitney, I kind of dabbled in podcasting, as most people did at the beginning of COVID. And me and my co-host did this like big, like 20-hour Iran-Contra podcast. And what I was really interested in with this was like kind of like what Jim was talking about, the monetary aspects of it, the money laundering, the banks, which then kind of opens into almost a sociological issue. You know, why these particular banks? How do these banks kind of fit together? What's the history that brought them together? How does all this start to come together? And we had so many people when we did this, like saying like, oh, it's, you know, 2020. Why are you talking about Iran-Contra? Why is this relevant? But the thing was, like, we never intended to get into the Epstein stuff, but we started to realize, like, we started picking up little threads. You know, I became very interested and a banker named Edmund Safra, whose banks were used by Oliver North's enterprise to move money. And, just kind of like researching him, like, oh, that's interesting. He was good friends with Robert Maxwell. Oh, he appears in Epstein's, Black Book of Contacts. And so everybody was talking about Epstein, but they were saying, what? Don't talk about Iran-Contra. That's ancient history. Well, it's like, how can we understand this, the corruption and ultimately the victims, if we don't understand like the concrete historical basis that made these things possible in the first place? That's always how I've approached it.
Right. When I was studying Skull and Bones, one thing I found very, very helpful was social historians.
Yes,
and look at the different families, different groupings, and what the people did. And I came to the conclusion that Skull and Bones, they don't just try and get quote unquote all the evil people. Okay, they get people that are going to be useful. Okay, very, very useful people, and a lot of times they'll keep them in the dark about as to what their end result is, and different things. Now, I want to just open the floor to a discussion of anything that people have to say about this, because again, we're all coming from different places, and we end up talking about the same group of people and the same amount, the same corruption, it seems.
Well, the song remains the same. To quote Led Zeppelin, what we saw, there's threads that go through this. I've written a book on Watergate, and there are people that are involved in Watergate that were involved in the Kennedy assassination and also involved in Iran-Contra. So these threads keep moving through their nexuses, and some people are up to, and I think that there's a lot of people that are affiliated with intelligence that are just doing their malevolent thing. And as far as conspiratorial things go, they're conscripted. There's various nexuses, and a lot of people that are in intelligence have no idea what a lot of other people in intelligence are doing. So it amazes me that people, and you bring up things like Iran-Contra and Franklin, and people think, well, that's ancient history. Because when I was pitching Franklin, editors were saying, well, it can't be happening now. This was an anomaly. This was the one thing. And while I was pitching Franklin, Epstein's network was Full Tilt Boogie. So I really do believe that a lot of the decisions in our government are predicated on blackmail. I've been at it for 21 years. I've known the names of a number of people that are blackmailed, and you don't have to dig too deeply into the Epstein case. And as Kris said, I put Epstein's Black Book up on the internet in 2015. And here's what was kind of interesting about that. So I acquired the Black Book in 2012, and I went to the editors that would still talk to me, the mainstream editors, which were dwindling. And I said, dude, I've got the Black Book. Let me write an article on it. And no one wanted an article about Jeffrey Epstein from Nick Bryant. That was just the way it was. And when it comes to blackmail, this has been going on forever. Alexander Hamilton was having an affair with a 23-year-old married woman, and her husband was blackmailing Alexander Hamilton. And then a muckraking journalist outed Alexander Hamilton on that affair. And because Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson were antagonistic, the muckraking journalist thought that Jefferson would appoint him in his administration. And when Jefferson didn't, the muckraker outed Jefferson on having sex or an affair with his slave, Sally Hemings. So this is nothing new. It's been with us forever. Now we have pinhole cameras, and that can capture everything. I mean, I think that that's the big difference now. And I think that that technology was being used and definitely in the 80s, the pinhole cameras.
Could I put a question out there along these lines? This kind of corruption, I have the impression, just comes with humanity in all our societies, and we might be as very, very rotten to the core, where some things could come crashing down. And what is it, if anything, about the American situation, our founding, our ideals, that if fanned out to enough people could stop an inevitable crumbling, if it is inevitable?
I don't know. You can go two ways with that, because I do think that there are deep tendencies in kind of American society and American political systems that are in competition with one another. You kind of have this one side that is very kind of centralizing, top-down control, probably, definitely interlaced with the use of money and compromise. But I think that America also equally has a tendency towards kind of decentralization. And I don't know, I have not really thought about a lot of deep politics necessarily from like hard political theory perspective, but I feel like that getting into that kind of more decentralized mode is an alternative to this sort of systemic, deep-rooted historical corruption that we're all trying to analyze, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah. No, and one thing I really enjoyed about Whitney's book. First off, we were just talking about one book, and then she delivered me these 900 pages, but that's really what it took, because that history, that she presented, that included stuff from Nick's book, from Jim's book, and from Daniel's books, and from Sherry Seymour's books, set the stage and showed how this compromising had been going on, and how that this had solidified the crime families and the intelligence, putting them together. And then you get into the second book, and basically, one of the things that it shows there is that these same people that were involved in these honey traps, and sometimes more on the outside than on the direct side, but to do a honey trap, you've got to have a room, you got to have some boys and girls, you got to have a controller, okay, and the controller is going to want security, and then you have to have all the technology, and you have to have that all there. And what Whitney shows in the book, especially in the second one, is how these same groups of people then are going from creating the honey traps to creating a honey trap on the phone, on the smartphone. Because if somebody can crack into your smartphone, they're going to have a pretty good idea of what you do. And so they're looking at these technological ways of control, of compromise. The other thing in these honey traps is that with having the law enforcement be compromised and being corrupted, it seems to me it has led to even more child trafficking. I did this book called Epidemic: America's Trade in Child Rape. And one thing that this lady brought up in that was that 20 years ago, we were talking about, 12-year-olds and up, and now, they're finding, dealing with kids in diapers that are being sexually molested. And so, the consequences of corruption are more than just, a government that's controlled by nefarious people. Any thoughts?
Well, the thing is, would you trust anyone who is aiding and abetting child trafficking? Our government, or some dark, malignant corner of our government, is aiding and abetting child trafficking. How can we trust our government? And that, I think, is the fundamental question. With Epstein, it's a perfect example. The government, the Justice Department had a list of 34 victims. And the Department of Justice did not indict Jeffrey Epstein on any counts of child abuse. They worked it out so the state could do that. And Alexander Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney for the District of Southern Florida, who made that really dirty deal with Epstein, he eventually became Trump's labor secretary. And when the Trump administration was vetting him, he was asked, why did you come down so lightly on Epstein? And he said, because I was told Epstein was intelligence and it was above my pay grade. And he has never denied that fact, that he had said that. And that's how perfidious it is. When you can tell U.S. attorneys to stand down. Now, who has the power in our government to tell a U.S. attorney to stand down? There's two people. There's the president and there's the attorney general. Those are the only two people constitutionally that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. Right. So with Epstein, strings were pulled at the apex of power.
I love how you have mentioned at least a dark, nefarious corner. And earlier, someone alluded to the good folks who are in our government and the institutions of power. What is your impression of the likelihood or the reality? The institutions that can and do inflict harm are held in balance or tension because of competing factions, including factions who are trying to do the right thing and be good. Can anybody talk to that possibility or your impression of that?
Yeah, my perception is that, in fact, there is kind of a continuing internecine warfare between various elements of the so-called intelligence community. I think particularly between the CIA and the NSA, between the CIA and the FBI. These are historical kind of rivalries. I think it became particularly acute when the CIA contracted with Amazon for massive amounts of computer database storage capability. I think the CIA realized that the real power is going to be in the digital accumulation of data and surveillance of people, which has traditionally been the purview of the NSA, which is what I think led to the whole Snowden psyop, I would call it, Edward Snowden. My view is that he was basically a CIA plant inside the NSA to humiliate the NSA, which he did quite successfully. And then somebody, probably CIA types, helped Snowden get to Russia through China, opened all the doors, paved all the way, got him there, protected him. And so whether Snowden knows it or not, I just paint him as a tool in a much bigger war. But I think there's a whole bunch of little fiefdoms within the government that are vying for their piece of the action here. And, there's like 40 some intelligence agencies within the government. Every department has its own intelligence function, which essentially is above and beyond the law some way. They're not susceptible to disclosures. They don't have to say what they're doing. They got to get out of jail free card.
I would definitely agree about the issue of like factionalism within the intelligence communities and the kind of government at large. One of the things that I really focused on when working on this book was the story of Ted Shackley, the kind of infamous CIA figure who surrounded himself with people like Thomas Clines and the rogue agent Edwin Wilson. And Shackley is like a really interesting example of this because he came from a very different kind of background from your usual high-ranking CIA officers. These were generally people trained at, Yale or Harvard, any kind of like Ivy League institutions, generally had Wall Street affiliations, but he had more kind of an unassuming background and came from a military career initially. And in the CIA during the 60s and 70s, Shackley was definitely the person who was very gung-ho about paramilitary covert operations. He was always the person who kind of like linked the more formal military structures with the intelligence agencies. When Carter, when his administration came in, they really tried to purge all these people out of the CIA, which ended up creating kind of a crisis, because then you had this situation where you had all these people who had this lifelong lives in the intelligence community. They had these vast networks, they adapted, and they effectively recreated those structures in the private sector, or they sustained them through drugs, money laundering, any kind of nefarious activity that you can get into. By purging them out of the military, you really kind of took them off the leash and let them run wild. With Shackley, his whole plan was to eventually, you would get Carter out of power, and then you would have a guy after Carter who would then reassimilate this stuff back into the intelligence community. That was supposed to be William Casey, Reagan's CIA director. But it never, there was a lot of scandals in the 80s. It never really fully happened. But that kind of sets the stage for the situation that we're in today, where we have all the formal intelligence agencies, just a mind-boggling and unnecessary number, but the world is dotted with these private military and intelligence agencies that operate, based on a profit motive, that are then, contracted by the government or by other intelligence agencies, and they have conflicts as well. So, it's in the government, but it's outside the government. It's everywhere at this point. It's a tricky situation.
What's really interesting to me is I eventually came across a couple of people who worked for the Department of Justice, and they were good people. And they gave me some information that I needed concerning the Franklin scandal. I cultivated a relationship with them for 2 years. And they wanted some information that I had, and I wanted some information that they had. And we were able to make that exchange. And they knew about the child trafficking, but they weren't going to jeopardize their house payment, their mortgage payments, their house payments, their kids' tuition. They were going to keep quiet about it. And these were good people, and they were aware of that dark, malignant corner of intelligence that we're talking about, but they were going to be mum's the word. And we see what happens with whistleblowers. If these two had been whistleblowers, their lives would have been destroyed. And I'm very grateful for the information that they gave me. I really haven't talked to them too much since then, but there are good people in the government that are aware of these malignant pockets, but unfortunately, they're too frightened to come forward and be whistleblowers.
Journalists are going to have to develop an entirely different model for how we collect information, sources, all that stuff, because we live in a world where everything's being surveilled. How to offer anonymity to sources is going to be an extremely difficult problem. Text messaging is not secure. Phones, email, anything like that is just an extremely problematic problem. I mean, it's not just the journalists that are at risk, but all our sources as well. So that's kind of a pessimistic side of it. On the optimistic side, I would just like to offer a personal viewpoint on this, which it's might have limited applicability, but I'm a firm believer that there's a spiritual dimension to things, that the truth that we have seen come out didn't necessarily come out because of our hard work and our smarts. I think that there is a spiritual realm that intervenes in some of this stuff, and that gives me some hope. that even if the powers that be tyrannize us, the evidence is going to be presented. It'll be there in some form or other, and justice will eventually be done. I don't know in what realm, but there's hope here. It's not, our work is not pointless. We have some kind of a function in this process. I don't know for sure what it is. We're not going to get fame and glory and riches, but I think that what we do is essential to the ultimate purpose of this whole thing. So don't give up.
I agree.
Amen. Hey, Daniel, we can hear you.
Proof of a miracle.
You can hear me. I apologize, guys. I mean, I agree with everything Jim Norman just said, except for the last hour, I've felt very old and in the way. And as I was listening to you guys, I thought of a couple things. One, you were talking about the Butcher Brothers. Good Lord, I haven't thought about the Butcher Brothers in a long time. I got stuff on the Butcher Brothers. They were involved with, who was Jimmy Carter's big guy? The guy from
Burt Lance.
Burt Lance.
Burt Lance, man. Burt
Yep.
Lance and even Chip Carter. And then Jim, there's there was an oil company in Kazakhstan that was employing the man who was all over TV after the Boston bombings, Ruslan Sarny. And interestingly enough, Ruslan Sarny then testified in a London trial for a guy from Kazakhstan who had stolen $6 billion from a bank there and then moved to London. So
the guy who shot himself in the back of the head while he was driving a Jeep. I think I know that guy. I wrote about that banker. It was Kazakhstan. It was a wild place. Yeah. So I'll call you up. We'll compare notes on that stuff.
And I have to agree with you, Jim. There has to be a spiritual dimension to this. If there isn't, you and I and all of us here have sort of wasted our adult lives.
Right.
Because there's easier ways to make a living.
Yeah.
So here I am, and I'm sorry it took so long. And I'm happy to be with all of you because you're my brothers in crime.
Well, Daniel, you've been an inspiration to all of us. I mean, you plowed a lot of ground there that has been fertile soil for us.
Well, Daniel, tell us about Barry Seal's trunk and how the FBI went in there and said, we're taking this stuff.
I had a source in the Louisiana State Police, and that was the last chapter, Barry and the boys, who could not believe how dark the whole thing was. Barry Seal's trunk was Caspar Weinberger's phone number, George Herbert Walker Bush's personal phone number. Barry Seal wasn't murdered as a result of anything the Medellin cartel did. He was murdered as a result of an order from George Herbert Walker Bush, who was then Vice President of the United States, and it was facilitated through Oliver North. I mean, I thought Barry Seal, I'm done. And then I came to Florida 3 months after 9/11 because my parents had retired in Venice, Florida, in the early 80s. And I would fly out from LA, where I spent my adult life, and see my mom and dad. And I never saw a cop the whole time I was in Venice. And then once I got down 3 months after 9/11, I got pulled over twice the first day I was there. And I said, do you think I should check in with the chief? And the guy allowed that I should. And I went down to check in with the chief. And the chief couldn't see me right at that time, but he turned me over to the lieutenant that was doing PR. And I said, all I want to know is one thing. Does Rudy Deckers have any local priors? Because he looked like Rudy Deckers was like the Ruslan Sarny of 9/11. I mean, there's always a guy that comes out front. That was Rudy Deckers. And the lieutenant gave me the most pained look in the world. And he said, I'd love to tell you about Rudy Deckers' priors, but the day after 9/11, the FBI pulled 2 Ryder trucks right into the parking lot. He pointed to the parking lot, and they loaded all our files, and then they drove off with them. They drove right onto a C-130 at Sarasota International Airport, which took off with Jeb Bush aboard. Rudy Deckers, by the way, was eventually arrested for drug trafficking 5 years later. I guess spiritually, you got to be spiritual, because 6 months after I was here, I was told by Wally Hilliard's jet manager. Wally Hilliard is an insurance executive from Wisconsin who retired to Florida, and within 12 months, he owned 30 to 40 jets. My dad retired to Florida and bought himself some lime green golf pants. So Wally Hilliard owned 30 to 40 jets, and his jet manager told me that his Learjet had been busted on a runway at Orlando Executive Airport with 43 pounds of heroin on board in July of 2000, 3 weeks after Atta and Marwan began taking flight lessons. I did my level best to put that out there, simply by registering the jet in the name of his wholly owned jet charter company. He escaped scrutiny. It never came out.
No, it's just amazing. I mean, the stuff you've broken, just amazing. I mean, we did a thing in LA with Daniel and Sherry Seymour. She was looking at the Promise software, and then you basically had, people that had access to phone conversations, behind the scenes conversations. And, if you have that type of information, you're able to do things that people that don't have access to that information. And she was, looking into the MCA thing that happened in LA. And she happened to mention that, well, she was working with 2 U.S. attorneys in LA that had a lot of information about it, but they were waiting for Ed Meese to die, before they would talk, who was an attorney general. And, Ed Meese hasn't died yet.
No. And Jim, speaking of Jackson Stevens and systematics, when I first heard about Whitney Webb, I was a little skeptical, okay? And definitely skeptical about the outfit that she was reporting through, Mint Press News, which turns out to be run by a guy who was a devotee of Ayatollah Khomeini, okay? And this guy who had a little bit of technical knowledge in Minneapolis, this guy was involved with systematics. And Whitney Webb's, the last chapter of her 2-volume set is all about you and Promise software.
I laud her for the voluminous amount of work that she did, and her researchers had. I mean, that is an amazing compendium of the stuff that we've been bumping into for a long time. It's useful to have that all pulled together in some place. And I think she did a very fair job of doing that.
You're right, especially for someone young. I mean,
yeah.
You and I and the rest of us here, most of us, kind of lived through this. So when you talk about J. Erland Grabby, I mean, boy, he was a god to me, but for someone who was in our age, how do they know? How do they know?
Can you speak to that?
Figuring out how to use search engines and reading lots and lots and lots of boring documents. Helping her with this book was a grueling process. It was a daily grind, but I thoroughly enjoyed it.
One thing that I've been saying for a while, somebody brought it up about how they're controlling the information to a certain extent, and we're taking notes and whatnot, and we hope that some of our research comes out about the JFK assassination. When you really just take a little bit of time and look into it, it becomes very apparent that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't shoot John F. Kennedy. Okay, but no matter how much of that research is out there, still the powers that be are trying to ram down our throat Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy, and they wanted to do that. Still, we regurgitate it. So
the mighty Wurlitzer.
Yeah.
Nothing happens unless the mainstream media reports on it. Okay. Right. I mean, I'm sure you, Jim, you worked for Forbes. I mean, that's a, you know, so they couldn't ignore you. They couldn't ignore you completely.
well, they could fire him.
Yeah. But you know, the story about Vince Foster and all that kind of stuff, or the systematic thing, that eventually got printed in this nefarious little obscure renegade magazine called Media
Bypass. I remember that.
And immediately that entity got set upon by the government, who basically, this former Army intelligence guy showed up as the editor there now to basically ride herd on that whole little operation. He's the one who ended up being involved in setting up Chuck Hayes for his bogus murder for hire prosecution. So the whole thing just got extremely weird. But the one thing that this guy told me when he came on board there, said, well, we're impressed. We never thought you'd get that story into print. Merely getting it into print in some form was like that was a key watershed moment. And I think that's what's happened with all of our work. Your books and these other books, they're there, they're in print. You can't just digitally erase them. There's something about having things on paper that is important some way.
Yeah, that's why I do what I do, and I'm a stubborn SOB. They've tried to put me out of business so many times, it's not funny.
I published Epstein's Black Book in 2015, and there has been tons of ink spilt about Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book, and only 2 publications have acknowledged my existence as putting Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book on the internet. One was Vanity Fair, that wrote a semi-decent article about me. And then I was mentioned by the New York Times. But then that was it. And I pitched Vanity Fair an article about Epstein. And at that point, I was way ahead of everybody on Epstein. And they shot me down completely. And it was very obvious to me that Vanity Fair was cool with writing an article about me. But as they learned more about Nick Bryant, they were not going to let me write for that magazine at all.
Even Vicky Ward, who eventually did write a big article for Vanity Fair, even she says that talks about the trouble she had with Graydon Carter.
Well, I know a true story about that, which is kind of interesting. When Vicky Ward was doing her thing, I think it was 2002, Graydon Carter, who was the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair, came to his office one day, walked into his office one day, and there was Jeffrey Epstein sitting behind his desk. So Graydon Carter obviously felt a lot of heat about that story because there were victims of Epstein that were willing to talk at that point. And actually, Maria Farmer had filed an FBI report about Epstein and trafficking in 1996. What's really troubling to me is the FBI covered up the Franklin network, did the heavy lifting, and it obviously covered up the Epstein network too. So you've got these large federal entities that are covering up the most heinous of crimes. And I don't think that it's all FBI agents that are doing this, but there is a cabal within the FBI. And I recently broke a story about Johnny Gosch, and I found a lead about Johnny Gosch that had been buried for 30 years. Paul Benassi told America's Most Wanted that Johnny Gosch was kept in a house with a chamber below it and near an elephant-shaped rock. And America's Most Wanted drove Paul out there, and actually Paul was corroborated by another kid too. And they found the house, they found the chamber below the house. And I found out who owned that house. And actually he was a serial pedophile. He was from New Mexico, and he got busted in 1963 for molesting 3 boys. And when he was in college, but nothing happened to him. And then when he was in Colorado, he left Colorado with multiple warrants out for his arrest. But then he doesn't have a record in Colorado either. So here's a guy that's been molesting kids, and he molested his oldest son, and he molested his wife's son or brother. So here's a guy that's been trafficking kids for a very long time. And I tied him to where Johnny Gosch is, and he's got a clean record in New Mexico about child abuse. There's some minor stuff, and he has no record in Colorado that pertains to child abuse. So who do I take this information to? This is valuable information. And I mean, I can't go to the FBI with this information. I called up this woman who runs, she's got a PhD in psychology, and she runs an anti-trafficking organization. And I asked her, what can I do with this information? This is valuable information. That guy is alive and living near Carlsbad, New Mexico. And someone should definitely, and I said, I don't trust the FBI. And then she gave me the name of a guy who ran an anti-trafficking task force, law enforcement in Southern California. So I sent him everything that I had, and he's having a hard time getting people to listen to him about this, which is status quo. I mean,
the proverbial get out of jail free card.
Donald Trump is happening right now. And we just found out that the guy that was in charge of counterintelligence for the FBI, Charles McGonigal, was taking money from Oleg Deripaska, who I've been writing about for like 10 years. And that's dirty. And then Jim Norman knows about the FBI. I mean, if you look at the FBI down here, the Sarasota office of the FBI has been looking the other way while a bunch of alt-right Trump supporters engaged in massive financial fraud and drug trafficking. Now, the drug trafficking is sexy, and I'm all into that, but the financial fraud is massive. Adnan Khashoggi, who ran that ring until he died, netted $300 million from one single fraud.
It's just amazing. I mean, it really is. And, you know, one thing that, you know, I enjoyed about Whitney's book is she brought in all of you guys, okay, did the deep dive and shows how, you know, this blackmailing and, you know, influencing, it's been going on for quite some time from different places. Now, Jim, I want to ask you, do we really know what happened to Foster, you know, in the Foster gate? Because a lot of people, when they're thinking about, okay, you know, I'm going to read a book about Epstein, they don't think that they're going to be reading about, you know, the Vince Foster story, but it is all integral in the whole scheme of things.
I came away from the Foster thing convinced that the sale of state secrets is a booming enterprise in Washington and around the country. When you think of what the government does, in effect, it manufactures secrets so that people can traffic in them. And I think it's a huge business. Foster, I think the conclusion I came to is that he, in effect, was kind of a bag man for the Clintons to raise money to pay off their off-the-books campaign debts. But then he went entrepreneurial in the process, according to one FBI person, and started pocketing some of the money. And apparently Hillary was getting a piece of the action on the Swiss account, whether she knew it or not. I'm sure she did. So the corruption was very deep. And the key point that I brought to the party is that when Foster died, he was under counterintelligence surveillance. That was the key fact that I had been able to corroborate from not just Hayes, but a bunch of other people. That changed the whole ballgame. I mean, when you bring in a counterintelligence dimension to this, this is serious. Then he ended up dead. Plus, there was this mysterious meeting on the eastern shore of Maryland at some big Democrat fundraiser's place the weekend before he died, where it looked like it was a cadre of people from the White House trying to talk Vince into taking a plea, rolling over, taking the blame for this. The whole thing would go away so that they wouldn't go any further. And apparently he balked at that, and bad things happened then. Then there was a mysterious payment to his widow, apparently, that Orland reported, to take care of her. So the whole thing got covered up, swept under the rug. But to me, the skirts a little bit on this whole sale of state secrets enterprise, which I think is just another line extension, if you will, to the whole drug trafficking, software trafficking, money laundering milieu, that it's the grease that keeps the whole process going, it seems like. The thing that's intriguing to me about Epstein and Hayes and Decker, the thing that connects those dots to what you see is that to finally take these players off the board, you find either bogus prosecutions or mysterious deaths that you really don't know whose body it was that they found. It seems like the system has various ways of truncating the evidence trail in these cases so that you come to a dead end. And in many cases, our sources become so tainted that they're not useful anymore. It's a shell game that is very frustrating to watch, but it goes on and on.
It will be interesting to see what comes out when they charge Donald Trump. Donald Trump was involved with Paul Manafort and Oleg Deripaska. Oleg Deripaska is totally involved in drug trafficking. Russian oligarch, that wasn't an expression I really knew until I found out that the co-pilot on Wally Hilliard's 39 weekly drug flights to Venezuela and back, who was a Guyanese, came from the most prominent family in Guyana. And as the most prominent people in Guyana, they got first dibs on jobs like Minister of Privatization. And his father had signed in 2005 $1 billion bauxite deal with Oleg Deripaska. You know, and this guy's son is running drugs for Wally Hilliard, who's running the flight school. And now the ring that I hope to expose in Gangster Planet is involved in both drug trafficking and financial fraud, and they all work for Steve Bannon.
Yeah,
under Steve Bannon.
Yeah, you'll expose it. It's just you know, I'm very hopeful, and I do think there's a spiritual part too. And you know, to get back to Mr. Trump too, I've got another author, Jeff Gilson, who did another deep dive because his buddy got shot, and he ended up finding out that his buddy was a big bag man for Maggie Thatcher and a couple of other people. And one story that he developed was that, you know, one thing that Maxwell did, okay, Epstein's good friend, was he was involved in a big money laundering, especially after the Iraq war, because there was these huge big arms sales, that there was a lot of bakshish going to the people in the Mideast, and some of the people up in the West said, wait a minute, we need to get some of this money too. So they started this, you know, big money laundering thing, and they brought in, oh, I can't say his name right, Semen Mogilevich.
Mogilevich.
Right,
yes.
Right. They brought him in, and then, you know, after a while, I believe, 91 or so, Maxwell, you know, jumps off of his boat, you know, and so this money laundering thing is still going on, and Maxwell had been the whale involved in the money laundering, because, you know, when you're money, it's good to have a whale there that you can hide things around and do things. And so they needed another whale to be brought in to do that, and that person was Donald Trump. Okay. And then, you know, it's also very interesting when you look very hard at Mr. Trump, you see places where, golly, it looks like this guy was a confidential informant in places. Because, you know, when you're a confidential informant, the people who you're confidentially informing to aren't supposed to be able to out you. You know, the only people that out you is yourself. So I think there's all of this involved in the situation. And the other thing I find very interesting is Daniel, Richard Gage, and a bunch of other people. And I get manuscripts sent to me, different things, and a lot of people are looking at this gangster planet type milieu that we're living in, where we've got a bunch of gangs, trying to do their own thing, and a lot of the motivation, a lot of the energy does come from the drug trade, because it creates this huge amounts of money.
With Trump, I really felt bad for a lot of Americans, because they thought that Trump was pristine. He was going to drain the swamp. And actually, just about every member of my family believed in Donald Trump. And just looking at his background, there's no way that guy cannot be compromised. He's been in bed with the American mafia. He's been in bed with the Russian mafia. He's had all kinds of sleazy financial deals. There's no way, and who knows what Epstein got on Donald Trump. There's no way that he cannot be compromised. And people just really wanted to believe that Donald Trump was going to be their savior. That's how lost a lot of Americans are, is they really believed in a president with orange hair. And I've always felt like presidents shouldn't have orange hair. So I didn't vote for him. Well, actually, I haven't voted for a Republican or Democrat since I got into Franklin. But with Trump, and I really find this quite fascinating, is who did he conscript to be his attorney general? William Barr. Yeah. And William Barr is one of the dirtiest guys in the entire history of the United States of America. William Barr put the finishing touches on covering up Franklin. Richard Thornburg started the cover up, but William Barr finished it. And then he covered up Epstein. And we all know the other malignancies that William Barr is involved in. So as soon as he named William Barr, I said, that's proof positive the dude's compromised. That's
Jim, jump in here. Tell us about William Barr and Mina.
Oh, that's another whole story there. Barr actually went down there to lower the boom on those guys for Clinton, I think, for skimming off the proceeds from the Mina drug and arms operation. But I'll give you my take on Donald Trump, because actually he and I go back a long way. It was a Business Week in '87, and I wrote a cover story about Donald Trump. It was the first time a major business magazine had put him on the cover. And so I spent a week or so with him. It was a straightaway business story, just trying to find out how does his business mind work? How does the system work? Of course, it was all a private structure. And so his emphasis was on cash flow, of course. What struck me is the collection of businesses that he was in, that all of which were likely to be problematic. He was building skyscrapers in New York. So he was face to face with all the unions there and all of the organized crime connections you would expect. He had gotten himself into the casino business, which is money laundering writ large. He'd gotten into the airline business with the Trump shuttle, which is can be a money laundering enterprise, and the airport unions and all that kind of stuff. Every which way he turned, he was rubbing elbows with organized crime or money laundering. Now, what intrigues me is that he became such fast friends with Rudy Giuliani. It was Giuliani that really took down the New York mafia families. And I think Trump was basically their vacuum cleaner to vacuum up the evidence to make those prosecutions work. And I think that's how Trump got his ticket punched for the big time. And I think, did Trump stay totally clean? No, I think he had to get his hands pretty dirty. But like Daniel mentioned, is that he became a confidential informant, or his organization did. Trump himself probably never touched the stuff himself, but his organization became a conduit for what I think was a key element in this internecine warfare between the intelligence agencies.
He bought Resorts International from the CIA. How do you do that? It's true.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think that this was all part of a much bigger war between the CIA and the NSA and other elements of the government. I think from World War II, the CIA and the mafia joined hands because the CIA had to launder a lot of money. Who do you go to when you need to launder money? You go to the mafia. And so they were combined like that. And so when Giuliani and that element of the Justice Department went after the mafia, they were going after the CIA essentially. And I think that put the CIA at eternal warfare with Donald Trump, and they were determined to take him down eventually. So I think there's all of these unspoken relationships that came together in the landscape here. And Trump himself, I think, I think was just kind of a figurehead that he symbolized a lot of stuff, but he didn't really accomplish that much. It looks like he hired all the wrong people who were foisted on him, I think, like Bill Barr. And, he's a good actor. He can talk the talk, whether he walks the walk or not, who knows? To me, it explains a lot when you see how a guy like him could get to where he got. You don't do that without the intelligence community putting a lot of wind in your sails.
He is the deep state.
Whether he knows it or not. I'm sure he knows it, but yeah. He's just another manifestation of the problem, in a sense.
It is interesting in the context of those kinds of palace wars, because my read on Trump was that he seemed much closer to certain elements in the Pentagon than necessarily the CIA. And there was a lot that he did that was kind of hostile to the CIA, but they were things that really supported, especially this kind of covert operations world, the kind of JSOC structure that sprung up there. It's not something I've looked into too much, but I know some people who have worked like kind of hard on that angle of things. That's been my impression. So I think that would fit very kind of closely with this, the broader Giuliani story that you were just saying, Jim.
I've read that, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I probably suspect that it is, that Bill Barr had the most power in the Trump administration, actually more power than Trump. And that wouldn't surprise me.
The week before Trump's inauguration, more or less, he blasted the CIA very publicly. And then Saturday, the day after he was inaugurated, by 10 or 12, he was addressing the CIA at CIA headquarters and basically kissing their ass and pumping them up.
Let me tell you an anecdote about Trump. The one thing I learned through everything I did was how to read FAA registration documents. And what I discovered by looking at the last 15 years of ownership of a drug plane was that it had 7 or 8 owners, but they were all one thing. They were all connected. And so I asked a guy in Newport Beach who worked for 40 years for something like the CIA. I said, I know I'm smart, but I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. How come I can figure this stuff out? And he said, because they don't bother to hide it. So Donald Trump comes along, right? And I know about Oleg Deripaska because he's connected to the co-pilot. And I know that Oleg Deripaska is a Russian oligarch and he's in charge of aluminum. And then what happens in 2008 is Donald Trump sells a mansion in Palm Beach to another Russian oligarch, the Russian oligarch that had the market for potash. And for some reason, potash is involved with aluminum. Don't ask me how. So I knew that somehow these guys were connected. How come people in Palm Beach who think Trump is a good guy don't know that he sold a mansion in Palm Beach to Dmitry Rybolovlev, okay? Who was the Russian oligarch that handled potash, and he had been charged with murder. He had been charged with murder. I mean, he was a Russian mobster. In fact, all these guys are Russian mobsters. And speaking of the FBI, I got one more thing to say, and that is the whole thing, this whole thing could have been exposed 2-3 years earlier when this Russian girl named Nastya Rybka, okay, in Thailand comes out and says that she's got video and audio tape of Oleg Deripaska conspiring to fix the election with some guy who worked for Putin. So they arrest her in Thailand. Now, Thailand is not a country in which America has no influence, right? Everybody knows that. The FBI didn't do anything with it. They let her sit there. And when she finally did get paroled a year later from Thailand, she went back to Russia, and I think she's dead now.
I remember sitting there with my dad and the professor, and my dad says, Vietnam War is all about drugs. There's these secret societies behind it, and I think he's talking about the mafia. And then he says, and communism's all a sham. These same secret societies are behind it all. How big a game is this? Definitely when you have sovereign countries, okay, sovereign countries generally have different agendas than other sovereign countries. Okay, so it's a real mess in trying to understand some of it all. But I really appreciate everybody getting together here and coming on and talking about this. I know I've learned some things, and and the thing about discussion too is it engenders thought that and thought doesn't just stop right now. It continues on. Maybe a couple days might think something else and relate about this. But so, do we have some last words from people before we have to go and do what we do? Let's start with Ed up there.
Twitter is usually the place that I'm the most active, and that's at EBBurger, BERGER, on Twitter. And there's a link to a blog there. I don't really use it that much, but people can get in touch with me via email through that if they're interested. This was a great discussion, and I'm really thrilled to have been able to be here with all of you all, because your all's work has all been such a huge influence for me and an inspiration. So it's been thrilled.
Nick?
I made my belated grudging leap into the 21st century last year. So you can find me at nickbryantnyc.com. I actually have a website at this point. And I'm even tweeting. It kind of goes against my grain, but it's the way things are now. And I would say, given what I've investigated, and granted I have a certain vantage point, I would say that blackmail is the grease of the machine, because politicians are highly sexed alpha males, and it would be so easy to compromise them. Clinton is a pretty salient example, but like Larry Craig, the senator, he had been in Washington, D.C. for 25 years. And he is from Idaho and a very conservative guy. He had the worst record, I believe, in the Senate of voting against gay rights. And he was a representative, and then he became a senator. And I wrote a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam, which Kris published. And Craig was a big-time client of Henry Vincent's. And then Kirby Dick made a movie called Outrage, and Craig was getting male prostitutes from other sectors. And then he gets busted in the Minneapolis International Airport in a stall trying to pick up someone who is a vice squad cop. Now, here's the guy.
He took a wide stance.
It's well, it's kind of interesting. I'm from Minneapolis, and I've been in that airport before. And I was sitting on the stall one day before my plane, and someone was slapping their foot on the stall next to mine. And I said, that poor guy, he's got to have a neurological disorder. But anyway, Larry Craig is a perfect example of someone who's obviously been compromised for a very long time. I mean, if he's picking up guys in bathrooms, I mean, a kid with a smartphone doing an after-school project for high school probably could have compromised Larry Craig. So I really enjoyed this discussion. It's Great to see you, Daniel. We've never kind of met face to face, although it's virtual. It's still meeting nonetheless.
Oh, that's way cool. Kris, can you make sure that we all get each other's information when we're done?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so Daniel, what's your thoughts about what's going on? What's happened?
It'll be interesting to see what happens next. Okay. Donald Trump is going to get charged, but what does he get charged with? Okay. I mean, the Democrats are no more interested in exposing the drug trade than the Republicans are, because they're at the trial just as much. So he's not going to get charged with what I know he's guilty of, because Oleg Deripaska was behind the 20 tons that got busted. 20 tons of cocaine. There's one simple thing that you could ask that would just blow this whole thing away, okay? The DEA busts X amount every year. What can the cartels produce? I mean, can they produce as much as the DEA bust times 50? Yes. So the price of cocaine doesn't even fluctuate more, doesn't go up and down. El Chapo gets busted, no big deal. The Mexican government's behind the drug trade. The US government's behind the drug trade. And the drug trade is the biggest earner for organized crime. And the guy, the UN guy in charge of money laundering in 2011 said the only money during the depression of 2008, he said the only money that was keeping banks afloat, big banks afloat, was drug money.
Yep. Amen. Mr. Norman.
I'm thoroughly retired now. I'm not writing. I'm just driving my tractor and splitting wood, but I am happy to communicate with anybody, but I'm trying to be more secure about that. And so I've recently messaging system called Session, which allows you to, you don't have to identify yourself. You use a public key system. It's better. It's much safer than Signal or Telegram or any of those things. So send me an email. I'll send you my public key. We can communicate that way. It's secure, encrypted. I think that's the way things are going to have to go from here on. And I'm happy to share whatever I've got. Anybody else who wants to pick up the ball and pursue some of this stuff some more.
Jim, you're a dean. You're a dean in this. Okay, you are the dean in this. Okay,
don't blame me.
I want to mention one other guy. Okay, who we should all know about. Craig Unger, who wrote American Compromise and House of Putin, House of Trump. He gets national play. I mean, his stuff gets published. I just wish we could feed him stuff, because he's been on the case for a while, as you have, Jim.
We all do what we can, and we will continue to do that. Don't give up hope. Our work has not been in vain.
Kris, you've been doing this forever. You're the I told you that you're the Lawrence Ferlinghetti of the Willamette Valley. But you've published, I mean, how many books?
About 160 or so.
Yeah, I mean, you've published 2 or 3 at least on what Nick's talking about child trafficking. You should be you're the acknowledged expert. So
well thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Indeed.
You have any comments or questions or thoughts here?
Yeah. President Kennedy said every man can make a difference and every man should try. At some point, it was clear in my head to amend that to, and every person needs to do all that they can. And underscoring the spiritual hope that we might have, I constantly recommend people to ponder the interviews of people who returned from near-death experiences that can be found on the Anthony Chene Production YouTube channel, CHENE, bookending that with all that's been found and speculated about the implications of quantum physics, and consider the hypothesis that we are eternal spirits who've come here for some purpose. It might be as simple as to discover that we hid ourselves from ourselves, and now the joy is in inspiring others to kind of quote unquote discover that. because only by imagining that we are safe / unharmable can we gird ourselves to keep diving into these waves with a good conscience, our only sure reward, as Kennedy ended his inaugural address.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
Well, I'm very hopeful, and one of the reasons I've been hopeful is there is this, the world has cycles. And one thing in I did some deep dives on secret societies and, how they want to control things and different things. And one thing that I discovered in this is, you have power centers and, and people die and things move around a little bit. And I really think there's an opportunity here with the personal computer and the internet, because, the personal computer allowed me to be a publisher. Without that, I couldn't be a publisher. And the internet has allowed us to put this information out there. And I truly think that, like Jim was talking about books. I mean, I love books. They just kind of sit there, till somebody picks them up, and books change people's lives every day. Okay. And so we have, and then we have these cycles. And I truly think that we're in a time of quote unquote revelation, a time where, a lot of things are being known that were hidden. And I hope and pray every day that, this will be actionable. People will see, well, hey, this corruption is just so overwhelming. Okay. We need to do something, I'm not into, an armed revolution. I truly think that it can be done with votes, and we can get enough good people, hopefully doing something, and create a better world for our children, because that's, Lord have mercy. Amen. Onwards to a better future.